can you hear me clearly? I think that's the first thing. I don't have a microphone or anything. I am so sorry. I'm so late. I really am. It's very embarrassing. I managed to turn up at the airport and forget my passport, and I got on another plane which was then an hour and 45 minutes late, and I'm very embarrassed. Thank you. I want this to be more of a conversation than me pontificating, but I was going to just begin with a little bit of a description of the world as I see it, as I've seen it in my working life, and use that as a way of starting a conversation. And I want to begin by saying that in some ways the story I'm telling is a story in which Ireland is an outlier. Because in many ways, the story of Ireland is a very optimistic story, and the story that I'm about to tell is a pretty pessimistic story. And maybe we can get into that a little bit. But let me begin by saying there are three periods I want to talk about. 1989 to 2004, which I want to call the age of the liberal global order. 2004 to 2014, which I want to call the age of uncertainty, and 2014 until today, that I want to call an age of populism. And each one of these ages has a very, very different economic structure, political structure, international structure, and media structure. It sounds a bit neat, but curiously it seems to be true. Right? And the first age, the age of the liberal global order, is the age in which the economic structure which is embraced is, of course, the economic structure of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. The 90s were really dominated by an idea that economics has been cracked, and it's about free markets, it's about privatization, it's about deregulation, and it's about opening to global trade. It's about free trade. And during this period, it feels, for a time, as though this is a very optimistic story. Of course, the Soviet Union has collapsed in 1989. The challenge of the communist system has come down. And this age seems to suggest that a more American model of economics is going to dominate the world. The second part of the first age is a political story, and it's a political story about democracy. During this period, the number of democracies in the world doubles, literally doubles. Goes from about 20% of the countries in the world having regular, free, fair elected governments to about 40% of the countries in the world very, very quickly. Right, within a 15-year period. Continued on that trajectory, almost every country in the world would be a democracy today, and indeed, that is how it seemed to people at the time. Famously to Francis Fukuyama, who wrote this book in the 1990s called The End of History, in which he imagines that liberal market democracies are going to be the future for everyone. That is the end of history. There's no alternative system. And they actually believe that these two things are connected, that the markets and the democracy are logically connected. That the way to get a prosperous economy is to be a democracy. People draw graphs at this period. So from 1804 to 2004, you can draw graphs which seem to show a direct correlation between being a democracy and having the highest economic growth in the world. But they also flip it the other way. It's not just that democracies make you prosperous, they also believe that as you became more prosperous, you were more likely to become democracies. So the theory there was that as your middle class developed, as more and more people came out of poverty, naturally people would demand a vote. They would demand a say in their government. People predicted, of course, this is going to happen to China. Right? They're looking at hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty, moving to a middle class. Naturally, they are going to move towards a democracy. And then they flip it again a third time. The democracy facilitates these free markets because it encourages freedom of speech, it encourages innovation, it encourages competition. All these good things are going to go together. So that's the story at home. Abroad in this period, this is the period of humanitarian intervention. And humanitarian intervention, in this period, this is Bosnia, this is Kosovo, this is Sierra Leone, this is Liberia, is the idea that the US and its allies can go abroad, they can stop wars, they can stop genocides, they can uphold human rights, and they can export a universal Western liberal vision of the world to other countries. They can facilitate the improvement of these countries. So let's take Bosnia. Bosnia, 1994, 37,000 people have been killed in the streets of Sarajevo. And it felt to me, I was a student at the time, probably the age of many people in time, it felt like something like Gaza. We were seeing on our television screens again and again, 37,000 people being killed in the streets of Sarajevo. The United States intervened. The Serb artillery was driven off the surrounding cliffs. The war ended. And it was a situation in which there were 160,000 people under arms in different militia groups. There were checkpoints up and down the country. There were war criminals on the loose. People were being massacred in Srebrenica. And by 2000, the number of people under arms had been reduced from 160,000 down to about 6,000 people. The checkpoints had disappeared. The war criminals were on trial. The crime rate was lower than Sweden. Right? So it seemed like an amazing success. And the story and the challenge at the time was a story about why don't we do this more? Tony Blair developed in Chicago something called responsibility to protect. The story at the time was we have let down Rwanda, for example. We didn't intervene to prevent genocide in Rwanda. This is a period where we are very, very optimistic that if the West wants to, it's going to be able to make the world a better place. And finally, in terms of the immediate political landscape, it is a period in which votes are in the center ground. So if you draw a graph of public opinion, it's a bell jar. The votes are where my fingers are, they're not where my elbows are. This is the era of Bill Clinton and the Third Way. This is the era of Tony Blair. This is the era of Gerhard Schröder in Germany. Enter our second period, 2004 to 2014, and things begin to crack apart. Things begin to crack apart first in the international sphere with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. It becomes apparent that this idea of liberal humanitarian intervention is running into trouble. It's running into big trouble in Iraq, and it's beginning to run into trouble in Afghanistan. Now, it's very difficult to get back into the mindset of that period. I went through this in many different ways. I was in Afghanistan, I was deployed to Iraq, and many of the people who were deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq with me had, not surprisingly, worked in Bosnia, worked in Kosovo, worked in Sierra Leone, and thought that they were engaged, some of them at least, in similar processes, writing constitutions, trying to get universities off the ground, trying to hold elections, etc. But the reality is that rather than the dream, which was that the Taliban would be toppled, Saddam Hussein would be toppled, and a much better society would emerge. I stood on a stage like this in Afghanistan at the beginning of 2002, and the two people who went on, the president of Afghanistan and senior UN people are on the stage, and I quote, this is 2002, "There is a consensus in Afghan society. Every Afghan is committed to," I quote, "a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law." 20 years later, that seems very sick. Right? It seems very deluded. Because quite literally, the US and its allies spent $1.5 trillion in Afghanistan. Right? That's $1.5 billion. They invaded to remove the Taliban, and quite literally, 20 years later, they hand the country back to the Taliban. And that is how much of a failure it was. Cumulatively with Iraq, $3.5 billion is spent. And in Iraq, instead of Saddam Hussein being replaced by this liberal democratic future, it's replaced by chaos, murder, and essentially Iranian-dominated Shia militia. So that's the international bit going on. In the economic sphere, of course, the big moment is 2008. 2008 financial crisis cracks whatever confidence there was in this economic system. It then becomes apparent that during the apparent years of growth and prosperity, we begin to become much more aware of what was hidden during that story. Median incomes had frozen. Right? Most people on low incomes, their incomes have not improved in real terms. Inequality had grown very, very starkly. Inequality between individuals, inequality within cities, inequalities between regions. So in the United States, between, for example, in Michigan, the old car manufacturing areas of Mississippi on the one hand, and Massachusetts on the other. In the United Kingdom, between London and the southeast and the northeast, this inequality is beginning to rise. And globalization, right, the great dream of opening to the world, has not been delivering in the way that people wanted. In fact, it's led to polyglot industries and a very strange relationship with China. And China, of course, brings us to the political. China is where we see, at this period, something that blows apart the story that as you become prosperous, you're going to become a democracy. So China in 2004, neatly for my story, has an economy which is smaller than the economy of the United Kingdom, beginning of this period of 2005, it's larger than that of the UK. 2006, larger than the German economy. 2007, larger than the Japanese economy. And as it continues to grow, and ends up taking an astonishing position in the global economy, an astonishing position. 75% of global steel and aluminium manufacturer, the #1 global exporter, hundreds of millions of people brought out of poverty. It does not become a democracy. During this period, in fact, people begin to become intrigued by the emergence of prosperous authoritarian states. You do opinion polls in Iraq in 2006. People are not saying the country we want to be is the United States, they're saying the country we want to be is China, the UAE, or Singapore. And this is also the period where democracies cease to grow, they begin to flatline. And in the field of media, which was my fourth category, this is the moment, 2003-04, where Twitter and Facebook are found, where the Arab Spring happens in this period, the Facebook revolutions of the Arab Spring, which totally transform the way the politics of different countries connect to each other. So somebody sets himself alight in a small town in Tunisia, and within a few weeks you have revolutions breaking out in Egypt, in Bahrain, Syria, in Yemen, and of course in Libya. And this is very unusual. In a previous period, you would have argued that these countries are very different each from the other, at least as different as Romania and Germany, or Spain and the Netherlands. Right? But social media somehow turns very, very quickly a single incident into a global phenomenon. But because of the nature of social media, it turns out that as well as being able to put people into Tahrir Square, the central square, to rebel against their military government, it also drives polarization. The algorithms of Twitter and Facebook are essentially there to exacerbate polarization. They reward you for taking an extreme polarized position because they reward the capture of attention. If I put out a thoughtful, intelligent, moderate point, I might get 200 likes. If I say Boris Johnson should be pushed off a big building, I can get immediately, right? And we can see that at this second period, the graph of public opinion begins to go from this down to this. It becomes like the kind of souffle I make and hope it collapses and becomes a U-shaped way. The votes are now where my elbows are, there are no votes in the centre, which ushers in the age of populism, 2014 to 2024. 2014, Narendra Modi is elected in India. 2014, ISIS, this extraordinary group dedicated to the creation of a global Islamic State, manages to capture the second largest city in Iraq and creates a new state stretching across the Syrian and Iraqi border. These are not the kinds of things that Francis Fukuyama thought the world had come for. 2014 is also when Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, begins to shift dramatically from being a relatively liberal pro-European voice to becoming increasingly authoritarian. 2015, the Law and Justice Party is elected in Poland. 2016, the Brexit referendum happens. 2018, Bolsonaro is elected in Brazil. And of course, most dramatically of all, in 2016, Donald Trump is elected as the President of the United States. And now we are entering a very, very different period. Within the Western democracies, we see a coarsening of democratic life. You see it, for example, in microcosm in the United Kingdom, where you have somebody like Boris Johnson trying to prorogue Parliament, literally lock the doors on Parliament to prevent them voting on Brexit deal. He's overruled by the Supreme Court instead of deferring to the Supreme Court, he then attacks the Supreme Court. He lies to Parliament, which means that the Minister resign and responds by trying to rewrite the ministerial code so he doesn't have to resign. Now, in the British context, this is pretty mild. In the context of Donald Trump, it gets to a much, much more extreme degree. Right? Donald Trump. Al Gore has a pretty good case that he won the election against George W. Bush by 500 votes. But Al Gore does not try to lead an insurrection against the cabinet. He accepts the rules of democracy. Donald Trump doesn't. Meanwhile, across Europe, new forms of populist movement begin to gather more and more strength. Get to a situation where the AfD in Germany now is in most polls the largest party. This is a genuine neo-fascist party with its leadership making public statements about deporting German citizens, deporting millions of German citizens. Currently sitting on 25-30% will vote in the polls. In France, Marine Le Pen is beaten by Macron, but remains the leading candidate to become the next president of France. Giorgia Meloni has won in Italy. In Sweden, in Finland, and in Austria, we find populist right-wing parties emerging. And of course, in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, an extreme Islamophobe, a comical populist, if he wasn't spouting dangerous bile, gets more votes than any other party in the election. That's the West. Meanwhile, in many middle-income, lower-income emerging democracies, Turkey, India, Brazil, a lot of Latin America, we begin to see more extreme forms of deterioration. We begin to see genuine moves against freedom of the press. In India, the development of a pretty aggressive Hindu nationalist movement, beginning to make increasingly extreme sectarian comments about the Muslim community in India, the creation of personality cults. And then elsewhere, this is the period where the number of democracies begins to fall. So whereas in the first period they doubled and then they equal out, they're now beginning to fall. This last period, we have seen in just over a year, 7 military coups in Africa. So these are 7 situations in which elected governments have been replaced by military coups. And coming into the back of that, of course, is the retreat, in that case generally of France, and the re-emergence of Russia, which is beginning to put in Wagner Group mercenaries to prop up regimes in Chad and Niger and elsewhere, and at the same time, the breaking of the international global order. So, as we come to the end of this period, one of the things that we notice is that The Good Friday Agreement, for example, which was a moment of enormous optimism, enormous hope, sort of almost miraculous hope, which symbolically in the 1990s represented for the world the possibility of peace building between communities that seemed entirely irreconcilable. At the same time, the UN is engaged in many of these other types of operation. There is, a lot of my friends are going at this period to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and confident that they're going to be able to bring peace there. People are engaging with Russia, trying to deconflict the situation between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. In Israel and Palestine, the 1990s is the time of the Oslo process. Heroic moves of Yitzhak Rabin, very, very dramatic moves, initially by Yasser Arafat, to try to find their way towards some kind of two-state solution. But in the second period, the United States and its allies begins to retreat from this kind of engagement. The emergence of populism is also the emergence of isolationism. It's a general view that from the left, all we do is cause trouble in the world. We have a very complicated history, colonial, racist, and maybe it's better if we just leave these countries alone. And from the right, it's none of our business, we don't care about these people anyway. There's a sort of weird combination of the left and the right together, being very reluctant to get involved in any form of constructive engagement. And, some of it is couched in this period in very, very beautiful language. If you're interested, there's an extraordinary interview that President Barack Obama gives to The Atlantic magazine in 2016, where basically he provides a very, very articulate account for why it's not in the United States' interest to worry about what Russia does in Ukraine. He basically explains that Ukraine is within a Russian sphere of influence. There's no point us thinking about it. We can see now, of course, that what's happening in Russia and Ukraine is directly related to our failure to respond in 2014 to the Russian invasion of Crimea. And I think we can sense that what we can see in Israel and Gaza is a direct result of our complete failure to engage in any kind of peace-building process since the late 1990s in that region. We are reaping what we've sown. Right. Let me now come to a conclusion of sorts. It's easy to read these three ages that I've set out as a story of profound pessimism, because it's a story where you have this apparent kind of great democratic moment in the first period, uncertainty in the second, and then populism and authoritarianism in the third. But of course, history is not that simple. History doesn't have a direction. And the way maybe the mistake of Francis Fukuyama is thinking that he could predict that we were all sailing into a sort of liberal democratic future. It would be an equal mistake for me to predict that we're all heading back to the 1930s. There are countervailing forces. Trump was beaten by Biden in 2016. And there is a pretty good chance that Trump will not become president in the next election. Right? Independent voters, 60-40, are not going to vote for Trump. In Poland, Donald Tusk has managed to defeat the populist government, which had dug itself in from 2015 until 2024, an almost impossible, inconceivable victory. Macron defeated Le Pen. Even in the United Kingdom, we've gone from Corbyn and Boris Johnson to the controversial but slightly duller figures of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. And we remain, I think, when I go to an audience like this, I don't feel that I'm standing on the edge of global precipice, right? I feel that we remain as a society, as a human species, basically more educated, more healthy, more connected, more traveled than we've ever been. That we remain, in many ways, idealistic, thoughtful. But we have a lot of work to do. I suppose my message is one against complacency. It's not that democracy is dead, it's not that liberalism is dead, It's that they have to be thoughtful. It's that we have to re-energize our democracy. That we have to make citizens feel that being citizens counts. For my money, that we'll have many different solutions in the room, right? I'm not offering solutions. But for my money, one of the key themes for me would be decentralization. Right? The way to re-energize our economies, re-energize our politics, is to take power out of the hands of a few people in the centre and push it down. Right? That is really active local democracy, that is local budgets, that's citizens directly engaged. That is, to my mind, citizens' assemblies, which I would like to see far more of. I would like to see in the United Kingdom a formal citizens' assembly as a third part of Parliament, reviewing the decisions for the first part of Parliament. But I think it's also true in economic policy. I think we're looking for a way to think about how to get our economies going, and not just look at financial return, but look at environmental impact and social justice. One of the best ways to do it is to allow local areas to determine their own industrial strategy. And it's much more likely that Manchester is going to know what its industrial priorities are than London. And we need to learn to let go, to give power to the world. And we also, and I'll finish on this, the thing that is going to change the most of all over the next 10 years is artificial intelligence. It is very probable that in most of our countries we will lose 30 to 40% of our workforce over the next 10 years. We are going to see AI move into domains we cannot begin to imagine. Its ability to synthesize biological substances, organic substances, right, which in the bad sense is viruses, in the good sense is new medicines. Its ability to synthesize material, inorganic substances, invent whole new types of industrial material at scales and speeds we haven't begun to imagine. Its ability to transform our productivity, our minds, provides for you, I would suggest, probably the thing that will define the next decade of your lives. And the thing that we need to cling on to through this, and I think this is where Ireland is in a very special place. I mean, Ireland is very, very unusual in being one of the countries, however gloomy people feel, right? I get in every country, and probably it feels rubbish. Right? It feels housing is completely unaffordable, the politicians are rubbish, etc. I can assure you, from the perspective of the rest of the world, this is where hope lies. The rest of the world, this is one of the most extraordinary economic numbers that anybody's seen. Your life expectancy figures, your education figures, and the way that has transformed over 40 years is unbelievable. The story of Northern Ireland is extraordinarily miraculous and should be inspiring for the Middle East and Gaza. And at the core of it, I think, is your ability to take the structural elements of the world, right? What's going wrong with democracies, what's going on with markets, the technological aspects of the world, and what's happening with AI, and insert into it where I think you come in, which is the ethical, the moral. Your ability to define what integrity is, define what you're not prepared to do, define what limits of growth are, and somewhere in the middle of the idea of the ethical is the idea of hope. Thank you all very much. So I'm going to stand up a little bit because I'm conscious that if I sit down, you can't see me. I apologize. So this question, which I think will be relevant to many of you, of the most fulfilling job you've had, the most powerful job you've had, I think is really important. The most fulfilling job I had was running a small non-profit in Afghanistan. I set it up, and we restored about 140 buildings in the old city of Kabul. We opened a clinic, small primary school. We worked with traditional craftspeople in Afghanistan. We exported their products. But it was very small, right? I had, at our maximum, I think I had 200 employees, and my budget was about £3 million a year. Fast forward to, I became the Secretary of State for International Development in the UK. I had a budget of $20 billion US a year. $20,000 million a year. And I was sitting there deciding, do I put $300 million into education in Ethiopia, or do I put $200 million into support for direct cash transfers in Kenya? And it was very frustrating and deeply, deeply unfulfilling. And it's very difficult to quite explain why. And I think one of the answers that I've come to in life is that it's not objective, right? It's to do with me, to do with your personality, it's to do with the way you work. I'm somebody who really likes working at a scale of 200-300 people, under buildings, seeing buildings being repaired, visiting the primary school every day. I'm not somebody who likes sitting in an office in London signing checks for $300 million a year. So even if on the surface I had more power in the second job, I had more money, I was having more independent lives, it didn't feel like power to me because the sort of, insofar as I'm interested in power, it's much more about being able to turn up at this small clinic in Kabul and say, oh goodness, why is the ultrasound machine there? Surely we need a new chair for the waiting room, right? Rather than, I'm going to give $300 million to people I'm never going to see, to projects I'm never going to visit, and somehow the whole thing is going to manifest itself. So I guess that's right. Yeah.
And when you were younger, you were a member of the Labour Party. What informed your decision to move to
Mostly the Iraq War. I became very, very angry with Tony Blair, and I began to project, probably unfairly onto him, a lot of things that I saw in Iraq. So what I had seen in Iraq and Afghanistan was a very surreal and cruel gap between the language, the rhetoric, the jargon of the international community and what was actually happening on the ground. And I really felt that this somehow revealed that Tony Blair was living in a world of technocratic fantasy. All this stuff about gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized states based on multi-human rights rule law, which never involved actually getting into a village, spending a night in a village, after understanding what people's real problems were. And his comments about Islam really wound me up. I mean, I spent much of my life living in the Islamic world. I believe that people's religious experiences are multiple and varied, but there are many, many different ways of being Muslim as there are of being Christian. And seeing Tony Blair claiming that he'd read the Quran in 3 different translations and he was therefore going to hold forth on whether Islam was or wasn't an existential threat, kind of troubled me. I thought this is a guy who just doesn't understand our world. Now, there are other things too. I mean, we talked about it, but I was running this project in the old city of Kabul, and I really felt what worked about it is we were working with the grain of the community, with the grain of their traditions. We weren't coming in and saying, we're going to turn this into public. We were saying, you have really beautiful crafts that we're going to invest in, you have amazing buildings that we're going to invest in. and we're gonna roll it. And I felt when I moved to Britain as a politician that it was in Cumbria and the Lake District again that I found the most satisfying type of politics. Working with local communities who were trying to build their own affordable housing, or were trying to get renewable energy built, or were trying to run some kind of broadband in their communities. Much more than what I felt, I think probably unfair, but what I felt was part of the traditional way, which was a much more centralized, theoretical, rational, we're going to remodel the country in this way. I'm much more sympathetic towards tradition, towards history, towards slow evolution. Yeah.
And do you think that history might vote Labour in the next election?
Yeah. So I can't really answer that question because when I do, I generate newspaper headlines. But the truth is, I'm incredibly disenchanted with the Conservative Party. I've left the Conservative Party. I think they are on a very, very unpleasant journey towards horrible kind of politics, right? I mean, Lee Anderson is literally, Conservative MP, Vice Chairman of the Conservative Party. Statement saying Sadiq Khan's American government is controlled by Islamists. I don't know whether I don't know if he believes it, but regardless of whether he believes it or not, the only purpose of saying this is to engender dissension, suspicion, and completely irrational hatred. I ran as an independent American. Sadiq Khan has been hopeless about sorting out the signalling on the Piccadilly line. But he is not controlled by Islamists.
You have criticised British Iraq's and turned a stable ceasefire and the British position on and what do you think that diplomats and the British government will continue to bring place?
Well, the problem is, I'm afraid, that Israel-Gaza is so intimate in our countries. And you can see this in the politics of Europe, Germany, the United States, Britain. We're not able, it seems to me, to step back and view it in the way that we would view other countries. I think if this were Sudan, or Burundi, or Myanmar, it would be quite obvious that there needs to be an immediate ceasefire. That this has to stop, that there's no strategic purpose to this. And we have the right and the authority and the legitimacy, occasionally, to look at other parts of the world and say, in our considered opinion, what you are doing here is deeply destructive, deeply damaging, and it's not going to achieve anything for you. Right? It's got to stop. But that isn't how it feels. Right? We are in a society now where it's deeply intimate. Jewish community in Britain feels very, very frightened. And in the United States, and anti-Semitism is real. And therefore, for many people, criticizing what Israel is doing in Gaza feels like a form of anti-Semitism. At the same time, Muslim communities are very, very angry at the horror and the killing of more than 30,000 people. 40% of them are children. And people are living in total echo chambers. I was living in Jordan for the last 3 years. My wife is on her way to Jordan again this weekend. She's in Doha on Monday, Tuesday. Our friends in the Middle East live now 3-4 hours a day on a diet of atrocities from Gaza. My friends in Jordan are currently divesting themselves from all US companies. Starbucks has basically had to shut, McDonald's has had to shut. Across the Middle East, people won't go. At the same time, if you watch the Hebrew news in Israel, there are almost no images of what's happening in Gaza. There are only images of heroic Israeli soldiers who've been wounded. And many of my Jewish friends are compulsively watching the 42-minute video of these grotesque Hamas atrocities. So both communities are feeding themselves on narrative increasingly convincing themselves that the only answer is to try to eliminate the other side. That no reconciliation is possible, no peace is possible. I mean, but obviously when I'm saying this to you, this is something which, as I go, this is, in many ways, Ireland can feel and experience and sense perhaps more intimately with more empathy than many other parts of the world.
One of the key differences between Ireland and Gaza is that many people would feel that the US is using their reach of power to undermine their democracy. I suppose how can we deal with that, and is there any way to that?
It's very difficult. I mean, the reality of US politics is it's almost unimaginable. I mean, the veto is less important. If the US abstains and veto a UN resolution, the UN doesn't have any teeth. The big demand that people would make who are on the Palestinian side of this is that the US would stop supplying weapons to Israel. And I think that's almost unimaginable in the current American political context. I don't think you can see significant numbers of leading Democratic or Republican politicians who would ever endorse that. Now, if they did, again, I think this is no longer the 1960s or 70s. Israel is now a very wealthy country in a way that it wasn't in the 60s and 70s. It is actually much less dependent on US support than it was in the past. And I imagine that if the US was to cut off its weapons supply, yes, it would have a significant impact, but I imagine Israel would then simply buy and procure its weapons elsewhere. I don't want to draw equivalences, but clearly, Russia is under enormous blanket sanctions, but it seems to find no problems procuring weapons from other people at the moment. And this is because when countries feel that they are in these kinds of existential conflicts, it's very, very difficult to... Now, what does this mean? This means that we need to retain a commitment to peace, that we need to continue to talk about what a peaceful solution could look like. We need to sketch out the options and the details. We need to keep pushing at the ideas of what reconciliation could involve, even if it takes 10 or 20 years. Right? We may not get there by talking about peace and talking about structured peace. We're certainly not going to get there if we just say, oh, the whole thing's completely dead loss, it's completely unimaginable, and us and the right wing of the Israeli government are going to reconcile and forget about it.
Changing topic a bit, I want to remember the demographics of your audience at this one, but do you believe the British Empire has been broadly a force for good?
Mount is a huge defense. Look, I would start by saying the British Empire was racist, it was colonialist, it was abusive. The biggest testament to what was wrong about it is that everybody who lived under the British Empire wanted out. So, however many railway lines Britain built in Ireland, whatever it did, the fact is the Indians didn't want the British to stay. Right? It's a pretty fundamental sense that people vote with their feet, or they think something wrong about it. I also do think, though, that we are moving into a period where this is becoming history. And I think it's dangerous to try to make... And I'm struck in India, for example, that Britain left India in 1947. That is a very long time ago now. Right? There are very, very few people left in India who remember actually what the British Empire was like. But the people who are talking most about the British Empire in India are people who've been born in the 1980s. And I think it's generally helpful in terms of dealing with nationalisms, dealing with international relations, not to spend your entire time raking over injustices that you never saw, that happened to people you didn't know. So, the British Empire was absolutely wrong. The Roman Empire was absolutely wrong. But there has to be a moment at which these things become historical. Right? I think Nazi Germany, beyond imagining, the most horrible ideological project imaginable. Am I going to continue to hold that against modern Germany? No. And I don't think it's very useful to try to do.
Okay, the question we've actually been asked the most to ask you is if you're a spy. So I
No.
will open it up to the floor now. So if you have a question, you can check up your hand.
You choose me. But choose some women as well as men.
Given the way you describe your work in Afghanistan, it's very, very fulfilling.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know what caused you to run for Parliament and indeed for the leadership of the Conservative Party. At the moment, I'm actually reading your book. Now, wherever I am, you're still a backbencher. But your description of the life of the backbencher is very dismal. Didn't surprise me. But what did surprise me about the book was the way you seem to be surprised about how ineffectual a backbench MP can be.
Okay, thank you. Well, look, I think that's right. I think the book is a story about naivety, sort of innocence and experience. And I had no idea what I was walking into. And I think part of the reasons why is that I had a very unrealistic idea of politics. I projected a lot of fantasy and idealism. I spent my time reading Aristotle and Cicero and thinking about, Gladstone and thinking I was sort of somehow going to... But I think there is something, it's not just me, I think there's something in the nature of politics which is a bit like that, right? We all go to school and we all have pictures of Nelson Mandela or Gandhi in black and white on our walls, and pictures of JFK, and our teachers are always telling us, you've got to be a politician, you've got to change the world. It was difficult for me listening to older people who said, what on earth are you doing? Being a backbench MP is the most humiliating, meaningless, horrible job in the world, because I was going to be a great statesman. I was going to change the world. So yes, that's partly what the book's about. Why did I run to be Conservative leader? For two reasons. Because I thought Boris Johnson was a very, very bad man, and I thought he would be very damaging to British democracy. And because I thought a no-deal Brexit would be very, very damaging for Britain. And I believed that I could convince the British public not to vote for Boris Johnson and not to go with a no-deal Brexit, because these things seem to me obvious. Right? Boris Johnson seemed to be obviously unsuitable person to be Prime Minister, and a no-deal Brexit seemed to be an act of extraordinary monumental self-harm. My failure to win those arguments was very, very depressing, because I realised what my limits were as a politician, my limits of convincing people to come with me. But I also learned something about the way in which public sentiment works.
So, you've mentioned before, you have unfortunately unsuccessfully run for the leadership of the Conservative Party, but you're running, as you said, against Boris Johnson, who was pretty much about as populist and right-wing leader as the Conservative Party could possibly dream of at that point in time. What would have been your plan? How do you want to try and keep the populist and right-wing elements of the Conservative Party at bay and try and keep yourself closer to centre?
It's a very good question. If I'd won, I would have faced a very, very big problem. Right? I was gambling very hard that by winning, I would have the legitimacy of my victory to say, okay, we are now going to stop these moves towards a hard Brexit. I would have pushed very hard for the customs union. I would have reached across to Labour. But it's obvious, if you look at the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson and his Truss and Rishi Sunak, that I would have faced a sort of civil war. The party would have fragmented 5 or 6 different groups. I would have had a hard right Brexiteer group that would never have been reconciled with my victory. So the question then is, would I have been able to reinvent British politics in the centre? Would I have had the skills to be able to reach to Labour, to get a soft Brexit through with their votes? Would I have been able to hold an election and win enough votes in the centre ground that I wouldn't have to worry about the right-wing Conservative Party? But it definitely would have been unbelievably unpleasant. I mean, remember, Theresa May had a minority government where few votes go in the wrong direction, lost bill after bill after bill. So I think part of my naivety would have been revealed then. I probably would have found myself in a much more unpleasant situation than I acknowledge.
Yeah, in your opinion, do you think we should use this law demographic? What should we be doing in our day-to-day to interact with other people in this place?
Well, I mean, I do think that, I feel, I mean, look, a lot of this is very pleasant, but I do feel that for many, many people, we underestimate how playing some role in civic life, whether through a non-profit or through local government politics, is part of what it means to be a community. That Aristotle is right, that we are political animals, that engaging with fellow citizens and finding what the good of our society is a rich and fulfilling thing to do. And I would encourage people, whatever else you're doing in life, you know, go work for a business or be an academic, etc., continue to have a part of your life that is engaging, and not simply engaging virtually on social media, but actually engaging with real people. And there the question then becomes, not should you be working to make the world a better place? Of course you should. The question that you need to answer through knowledge of yourself is, at what level do I want to do that? So let me give you an example. Let's say that you thought that child maternal health care is the thing that you cared about most. That's not the important discovery. Because that could mean almost anything in your life. That could mean you are moving to Africa as a midwife to sit in a village delivering babies, or it could mean that you're heading off to the World Bank in Washington to write policy on child maternal health care, or you could be working for an aid agency giving money to non-profits, or you could be working in a think tank writing policy papers. And what everybody needs to work out in their own life is, where are you most happy? Right? I'm most happy in the village, you might be most happy in the World Bank. But we get caught at the first thing, which is the easiest thing. You know, what's the issue I care about? I care about climate change, I care about social justice, okay? That's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is, which part of that world do you want to work? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm Rory. I'm also Rory. I have a question relating to NGOs, so non-governmental development organisations. Having done an internship in one and seeing how difficult it is, how stretched thin the workload is, what do you think are the other challenges? What do you think are the biggest challenges facing non-governmental development organisations at the moment?
So I think the biggest challenge facing NGOs international and international government is the scale of the problem is beyond imagining. Right? We've gone from 180 million people living in extreme poverty in Africa in 1980 to 470 million people today. About 3/5 of the world population is living under $6 a day. 1 in 10 children born in the world will be born in Nigeria by 2050. There are approximately 750 million people in the world today who cannot meet their most basic needs. These are people who will be struggling to find food once a day, who will not have adequate shelter over their heads, whose children will be dying at disproportionate rates, who will be struggling to get kids into school, and who will be dying young. And our NGOs are unfortunately caught up in a whole series of mechanisms. Bureaucracy, grant writing, weird risk structures, political wars about localization against international, mad cost structures. And the solution, I think, is direct cash. We need to get these NGOs out of the way, and we need to give direct cash. Direct cash transfers to the extreme poor are revolutionary, and they're much more dignified. Because the problem with traditional NGOs is you're turning up the community and you are teaching somebody to fish, as it were. And teaching someone to fish is a practicing thing, right? You're turning up and you're effectively saying what you lack is knowledge, and you're giving knowledge. The truth of the matter in many of these communities, they already know how to fish, they just don't have the money for a fishing boat, and they don't want to fish. They want to open a bakery. And cash is what allows each individual to determine what their own priorities and interests are. We should trust them. We should give them dignity. There's a man here who's had his hand up a lot when he read this. With a black cap, yeah. Oh, you're not putting your hand up?
Okay, sorry, I was. Excuse me, I interrupted you. I was just interested about your point about sort of discontents of globalisation and the winners and losers economically and the political effects that has. You mentioned decentralisation as your solution, whereas, I mean, the solution put forward by Trump, Nigel Farage and others has been protectionism. Why do you think decentralisation is necessarily better than protectionism, and is it not sort of the same thing?
Yeah, I think that they are quite different. I mean, I think protectionism is essentially a theory that a country is better off by putting up walls around it. And in the most dramatic case, of course, trade wars. And trade wars don't make fundamental economic sense. I mean, we're struggling to feed people, we're struggling to have productive economies, and it's just a sort of mathematical fact that, broadly speaking, you end up in a very, very weird situation if you exclude other people's goods and you try to manufacture everything yourself. Now, the US may be an exception. The US is so large, it's almost like a world in and of itself. But for a normal European country to try to do that would be catastrophic. So that's why I think the best thing that Britain could do at the moment is rejoin the customs union. I mean, it's completely insane to try to cut ourselves off from our closest trading allies. And it's particularly insane in a world of protectionism because you're not going to get free trade deals with China and the US and all these things that Liz Truss dreamt of. Because in a world that doesn't happen. Decentralization is different. Decentralization is economically about a city, Manchester for example, deciding what investments its government needs to make in skills and infrastructure. So for example, if you were, or if I were the mayor of Manchester, the two most obvious things are a train line between Manchester and Leeds. It's completely ridiculous, right, that there's no train line between these two major cities. It could provide great urban accommodations in that kingdom. And the second is skills, getting the right kind of vocational investments, the right kind of skills, the right kind of apprenticeships, which fit the particular economy of Manchester. That's the decentralization. I mean, it's about saying, not some genius in London saying, you know, what does Manchester need, but somebody working with greater industries in Manchester saying, actually, what you don't understand about Manchester is what music means for our economy, and the kind of skills that we actually need around that to make our progress. So, I'll let you. Well, okay, let's take two questions and I'll do it two at a time.
You talked a lot about testimony in the book, and Andrew, I think about this is like particularly relevant when we're choosing what we do with our lives, and we want to look at positive role models of yourself and your culture, obviously influence of other people. And I think there's something that gets very pessimistic, is knowing all the sort of disadvantages of any one action they could do, and trying to find a role model who maybe has as few of those as possible. I think that listeners of your podcast would be surprised to hear from you and people around you how much you maybe fly around the world. And I think that you are a very considerate person. I don't ask you this to try and embarrass you in any way, that you're a big thinker, deep thinker. And so I want to understand a bit more your thoughts on that and how you've weighed up the pros and the cons of flying around the world, and then you've come to the conclusion that that is overall for the greater good or for your personal commitment.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you for the talk. My question would be, what role does the United States and the West play in Ukraine moving forward? And my second question would be, can you run for the Prime Minister of the United States? Thank you.
Okay, let me try to take those two and sort of weave them together. So let's take flights and pessimism together. I'll do flights and I'll maybe and then I'll do do the US and the world. And they are connected. Flights. Look, my role is international. What I have to contribute to the world is about understanding other people's countries. I ran a major international development organization until recently, until about 2 months ago. I ran Gift Director. I believe very, very strongly that a fundamental problem in the delivery of development programs is that we don't know anything about these countries, and that it is catastrophic to manage programs in Rwanda or Eastern DRC without visiting them. That you must be on the ground, because only by being on the ground do you begin to get any sense of what you miss on a Zoom call or watching this. So it's a good challenge, but I think that in a world that is deeply interconnected and where we are facing a very, very large number of global threats, many of which are very specific to the countries from which they come. Right? Let's say you care about climate. Right? What is the big opportunity in climate? The big opportunity in climate is connecting renewable energy in Africa to industrial production in Africa. Right? At the moment, bauxite is mined in Guinea, it's then shipped halfway around the world, and then coal-fired stations in China process it into aluminium. Africa is an ideal place to be thinking about very large-scale solar, very large-scale wind, and connecting it to industrial production at the place which is mined. What are the problems with doing that? Politics, culture, the local context of Guinea. What are you not going to understand by sitting in a seminar in Trinity College Dublin is that you're not going to solve the problems of the world, unfortunately, if you are trying to engage with this kind of stuff without going to other people's countries. What's the US's role in the world? I think the key for the US and its allies is to not follow the danger of lurching from over-engagement to isolation. The risk is you screw up in Iraq and Afghanistan and you just give up and say, I don't have anything to do with the world at all. What we've seen since the US has withdrawn since 2014 is not what we hoped. People hoped that maybe as the US withdrew, peace would emerge, lovely grassroots movements would emerge, the US would be replaced by fantastic indigenous movements, and as the imperial power retreated, the world would get much better. What we've actually seen since 2014 is every year since 2014, there have been more civilians killed in conflict, more refugees, more internally displaced people. And this is because the US withdrawal has not coincided with the world becoming a better place. The US withdrawal has coincided with Russia going into Ukraine, with Sudan tearing itself to pieces, with Eastern DRC mashing itself up between its neighbors, with Myanmar launching extreme brutal attacks against minority communities. And in the Horn of Africa, the disappearance of the US doesn't mean grassroots movements suddenly come to Somalia and restore peace. What it means is UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, China enter the spaces left behind. So the US and the West, right, and I would include Ireland in this, needs to find a way of playing a modest, humble, prudent, thoughtful, engaged role in the world. Not give up on the world, but to do so needs to restore its moral credibility. That's why what's happening in Gaza is so damaging. For the US and the West to be able to play a constructive role in the world, it needs to seem fair. It needs to seem objective. It needs to be serious when it talks about human rights. It needs to be serious when it talks about peace. It needs to be thoughtful in the ways in which it does it. It's going to be messy, it's going to be compromising, it's never going to be perfect. But, and this is, I think, the point about pessimism and optimism, often the kind of optimism that is preached in venues like this is actually a form of pessimism. Right? The form of optimism that says, we're going to create a gender-sensitive, multi-ethnic, centralized state based on democracy, human rights, rule of law, is actually pessimism. Somebody who says that is so disconnected from the reality of the ground that they probably secretly don't think they can do anything about it. Somebody who says that we can make Britain carbon neutral by 2030 is actually suffering from a form of pessimism. They've set up an objective which they know is unachievable, and they're doing it in order to feed a sense of despair. Real progress in the world requires a very detailed, concrete sense of what can and cannot be done. Ought implies can. You do not have a moral obligation to do what you cannot do. You need to look at the numbers, you need to look at the people, you need to look at what's politically possible, you need to think about the arguments, you need to think about the facts, and if you do that, then you can change the world. Right. The basic insight is that if we cannot ever do as much as we pretend, we can always, as humans, do much more than